would ask that you open up in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 39. In just a couple seconds, we're going to read the entirety of this chapter, barring the last few verses or so. So we're going to read about 20 verses right in a row, and so you would be greatly benefited by having it open to Genesis chapter 39. We're going to talk about the story of Joseph this morning. And Joseph is one of those characters that I think we talk about a lot, but we never really talk about a lot, if that makes any sense. We talk about him, we talk about the events surrounding him, but we never really talk about who he is. And I think it's always important when we talk about Bible characters to really get into who the character is and understand what makes sense to them or what makes them tick in the context of their stories. And Joseph is one of those characters that we always associate with stories rather than how he responded necessarily to the stories. We talk about him being sold by his brothers off into slavery. We talk about him having interpreting the dream where he rises to the power of second in command in Egypt. And we talk about him kind of as an auxiliary character to all of these other stories. And one of those stories that we talk quite a bit about is the one where he resists temptation in Genesis chapter 39. And we always kind of end it the same way, that whenever temptation comes to you, you run from it. I'll be honest, I have not been around for as long as some people in this world, but I have yet to see anybody that stares temptation in the eye and literally just turns and runs from it. And so what I want to talk about this morning is how he got to the point, not where he just kind of resisted temptation, but how he outright ran from it, because I think that's a very extreme measure sometimes that can also come in very handy in certain occasions. The story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39 is interestingly placed in Scripture because it's juxtaposed with the chapter that comes right before that. If we don't talk about the characters as much, we definitely don't talk about Genesis chapter 38 as much, which is this really awkward story between Judah and where Judah has relationships with his daughter-in-law, doesn't understand that she's his daughter-in-law, and then you have the son that kind of arises from that union that will eventually create a lineage in the Old Testament. And the reason that story is juxtaposed with the one in chapter 39 is Judah has just absolutely no regard for any kind of semblance of morality. He has no interest in seeing what's right. He has no interest in practicing what's right. He walks into a town, he sees a woman of ill repute there, and the events happen, and then he goes on about his life. And that's not the person that Joseph is. And so if you listen to nothing else, at least for the first 38 and a half seconds of this lesson, I want to impress upon you just how unique a character Joseph is for his own time period. Joseph is a person who stands up for what is right. He is a man that is consumed with morality when it seems like the very easy thing is to not be consumed by morality. And so after that story in Genesis chapter 38, you have this one starting in chapter 39, where it picks up literally right in the middle of Joseph's life. Verse 1. It says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, brought him from the Ishmaelites, who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man." That's a theme you see repeated many times throughout the Old Testament. "And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. And so Joseph found favor in his sight, and he became his personal servant." We would call this a chief butler, chief steward, kind of a right-hand man. "He made him overseer over all his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. But it came about that from that time he made him overseer in his house and over all he owned, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there did not concern anything himself with anything except the food which he ate." The reason that the text goes into such great detail in these first 6 verses is because he's trying to impress upon us how much responsibility Joseph had. This was not somebody that was a low man on the totem pole. This was not somebody who was kind of charged over Potiphar's dogs, where he just kind of was the guy that dished food out in the bowl every morning. Not that taking care of dogs is a bad thing, but he wasn't that guy. This is an Egyptian officer in one of the most vaunted armies of the time, and you have Joseph rising through the ranks at a very rapid rate to the point that he is second in command over everything that this guy has in his house, which is most likely a sizable amount of possessions. Now Joseph, verse 6, was handsome in form and appearance. Well, why are you bringing that up? Because of what happens. It came about that after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." Very simple proposition. He refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns into my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great evil and sin against God. We're going to talk about that more here in just a second. Verse 10, as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he didn't listen to her or lie with her, be beside her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the other men in the household were there inside. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. He left his garment in her hand, and he fled, and he went outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought in a Hebrew to make us a sport. He came in to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me, he fled, and he went outside. So he left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, the Hebrew slave, whom you brought to us. Notice where the accusation is coming from Potiphar's wife. Whom you brought to us came in to me to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Now when his master, verse 19, heard the words of his wife, which she had spoken to him, saying, this is what your slave did to me, his anger burned. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, into the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. And you know how this story transitions from that point forward. Oftentimes when we read the story of Joseph and Potiphar, this little one-chapter exchange, we either look at it in one of two ways. We either look at it as a transition point from slavery into all of a sudden becoming the second in command of Egypt itself. Which, by the way, I always wondered if Potiphar ever interacted with Joseph later. There are obviously two officials in Egypt. You always wonder if Potiphar ever saw Joseph and thought, hey, you're that guy. Regardless, you either see it as a transition statement or you see it, and most oftentimes seen it as a case on sexual immorality. That this is a chapter, this is a lesson that deals exclusively with sexual immorality, and so because of that, the one big thing that we can pull out of that is that you just need to run from immorality. As a matter of fact, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18, Paul literally says, flee immorality. And so if there's only one thing we can pull out of this chapter, it's that when immorality appears, we run from it. The problem I have with that, and by the way, this is a great lesson on sexual immorality. The problem I have with that is that we sometimes relegate it when it becomes about that. We relegate it to primarily a junior high school Bible class study. And that the only real thing that you need to do with this chapter is you just need to run from immorality. That's true. But really what this chapter is about resisting temptation. And especially it's about resisting temptation when the temptation gets really, really intense. How do you respond to that? We'll talk about this a little bit later, but I want you to notice first and foremost from this chapter that Joseph's first reaction, ladies and gentlemen, was not to run from the sexual immorality. And so when we talk about that in our junior high and high school classes, we skip over a whole bunch of stuff that we can do in the meantime. Now, if you need to run from immorality, run from it by all means. But that was not Joseph's response. Joseph's first response was to refuse, to refuse, to refuse. He resorted to running. And so what I want to look at this morning is just why he decided to run. How did he get so intense that he decided to run from the temptation that was constantly presenting itself in front of him? One of the things that I think we vastly underestimate in this entire story is Joseph's fortitude. We talked already about how he's kind of this isolated man, where he's kind of this person who exists as kind of a model in his own time, where everybody is kind of engaged in sexual immorality, and Joseph stands above all that. But what we don't oftentimes talk about is Joseph's fortitude. The fact that he stood up to Mrs. Potiphar day after day after day after day and still maintained his integrity, not just here, but literally throughout his life. But how did he get to the point where his only response was to simply run from temptation? I'll be honest with you, I think the first thing was that he realized that his body was not his to give. I appreciate Scott reading from us from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I would encourage you to jump back over that because Paul makes some statements here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 that I think are worth repeating. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in verse 12. This comes right on the heels of a discussion about how a guy in the church there has his father's wife, and then he talks about how there's all this immorality that's in the world. And he mentions in the verses leading up to that, in verses 8 through 11, he talks about you used to be this way. In case you're wondering, Corinthian church, you used to be a people who were immoral. You used to be a people who were liars, who were thieves. You used to be these types of people. But you were washed and you were sanctified. And I think the bridge that he makes from that general statement towards the church there about how you used to be these people is this realization that he touches on starting here in verse 12. In verse 12 he says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 12. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I'm not going to be mastered by anything. Why is that? Because in verse 13, food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food, but God will do away with both of them. There's this temporality here. Yet the body is not for immorality, but it's for the Lord. And the Lord is for the body. Now God has not only raised the Lord, but will also raise us up through his power. Do you not know then, verse 15, that your bodies are members of Christ? This is one of 2 times in this passage he makes this argument. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? May never be. Or do you not know, verse 16, that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says, according to Genesis chapter 2, the two shall become one flesh. He's talking about that very literally. Verse 17, but the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. Flee immorality, verse 18. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? This is the second time that he says it. Whom you have from God, and that you are not your own, for you have been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. There are certain things that I think that are blanket statements that if we could just kind of communicate to the world and especially communicate to ourselves, I think a lot of these temptations sometimes would go away. For instance, when we talk about sexual immorality, when we talk about alcoholism, we talk about smoking, we even kind of delve into the realm of obesity. We talk about all these things as being negatives and sins in certain capacities. And we talk about how we should stay away from these things, how we shouldn't do this, how we shouldn't do that. But this core concept that's talked about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 oversees all of that. It's kind of an umbrella passage, more or less, that Paul gives forth to describe this one universal concept that all of us need to understand. Your body is not your own. You're a steward of that body. I love how C.S. Lewis put it once. He said, you don't have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body. Our body is a possession that is given to us by God that we are to be stewards over. And so when you look at this story about Joseph and about sexual immorality, it's more than just about him resisting temptation. It's about him, ladies and gentlemen, being a good steward of what he was given. Now that's the thing that Joseph knew very well. Joseph is the chief butler over Potiphar's house. He would eventually rise to be the second in command over Egypt. So Joseph knows what being a steward is all about. And so in that sense, this story of him looking at this situation where he says, I am not yours, you are not mine, you belong to him, he belongs to you, he understands what authority is all about. As a matter of fact, when you look at the 2 things that he says, the 2 reasons he gives for why he is not going to engage in sexual immorality, they're twofold. Number 1, he says, you are your husbands. And I can't, number 2, do this great sin and sin against God. Stewardship is given to him by God. The responsibility of where he is, the responsibility of the possessions and things that he has, those are given to him by God. Later, when he's talking to his brothers, whenever they have this back and forth about how, oh yeah, sorry, we sold you into slavery, and I hope you can forgive us of all that little exchange. Eventually, Joseph will say, God meant it for, you meant it for evil. God meant it for good. God is able to take situations and mold them to his own purposes. He's able to take whatever happens and mold them to his purposes. Joseph understood his place. And his place in that household, despite having full authority over every single thing in the household, the one thing he did not have authority over was Potiphar's wife. And that's why he looked at the situation. He says, my body is not my own. Your body is not mine. We cannot engage in this because that is a breach of stewardship, is a breach of rights. It's just sexually immoral, and we're not going to engage in it. This idea of your body is not your own is one of those things that I wish a lot of us and the world would kind of put in our minds. Because when you hear, for instance, the debate, and I say debate only in the sense that other people are having this conversation, when you look at the debate around abortion, as if there is really a debate anyways, but when you look at the debate around abortion, always the thing goes back to the idea of my body, my choice. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing about that statement that is factually correct at all. Number 1, there's 2 bodies, but number 2, you are the steward of that body. And so when you say to somebody, or when somebody says to you, it's my body, my choice, that's not accurate because it's somebody else's body that you are being entrusted with. We have a stewardship about our lives. And we have a sense of responsibility towards the things that are entrusted within us, entrusted to us, that we need to do well with. And so why did Joseph run? First and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, because his body wasn't his to give. But second off, and this is much more practical, if you want to take it away from the theological, move it towards the practical. Let's just be honest, earlier resistance had not worked. We talked about it a minute ago that Joseph had said time and time again, day and day and day, I'm not going to engage in this with you. And yet she kept coming at him. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand and see how many people have ever been in a situation like this, but just ask yourself, when was the last time you were in a situation that was similar to this? When there was a temptation, there was something coming to you day after day after day that you knew you needed to resist. Whether it's a temptation, whether it's a person who is trying to get you engaged in sin, or whatever the situation is, when was the last time you had a temptation that was brought forth to you every single day? If I were to guess, I would bet it's probably pretty recently, if you're not engaged in it at this very moment, where you're constantly trying to battle temptation and battle the fact that sin is always at your doorstep. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 10, whenever God talks to Cain, he talks about sin. He says, sin is at the door and it's crouching for you, but you must master it. We all fight this. We all are engaged in some kind of battle against temptation or against immorality of some kind. And so we know what Solomon is talking about here, or we know what Joseph is talking about here. In Proverbs chapter 27, it seems like every week this quarter I bring up Proverbs. I wonder why. But in Proverbs chapter 27, starting in verse 15, there's two verses here. Solomon says, a constant dripping on a day of steady rain, and a contentious woman are alike. He who would restrain her restrains the wind and grasps oil with his right hand. I want to read that again. A constant dripping on a day of steady rain, and a contentious woman are alike. He who would restrain her restrains the wind and grasps oil with his right hand. There are certain people that just kind of have this dripping effect. There are certain situations that just kind of have this dripping effect, where it's not a temptation that you need to necessarily worry about once, a temptation you need to worry about 30 times, but a temptation that you need to worry about constantly. And as that dripping rain will slowly eat away at even the most impenetrable rock, so temptation comes to us. And it's unique for everybody. Your temptation is not the same as mine. My temptation is not the same as yours. It's different temptations, but the method is exactly the same. And so when we talk about Joseph in this passage literally running from temptation, that's because everything else he had done up to that point hadn't worked. Now, did it result in him being thrown in prison? Yeah. But I would wager that he probably didn't mind being in prison because he was away from the temptation that was constantly plaguing him. I want you to look at somebody like Samson, Joshua chapter 14. Judges chapter 16. Samson is almost universally regarded as one of the most powerful individuals physically that you find in Scripture. I don't know of many people that really can overpower Samson. Goliath's up there. It'd be interesting to have a battle of all these different strong people in Scripture. Samson's up there. And in Judges chapter 16, I want you to look starting in verse 6. He meets a woman named Delilah. And by the way, the text goes through great pains in the 2 chapters leading up to this to talk about how this guy can literally not be beat by anybody. And then Delilah enters the picture. And in Judges chapter 16, starting in verse 6, it says, Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength is, and how you may be bound to afflict you. First question I have is, why are you asking that? I don't know how Samson never really thought to have a follow-up question to that. I want to know how to bind you to afflict you. Spouses, never ask your husband or never ask your spouse how you can hurt them. That's never a good start to a conversation. Samson said in verse 7, if they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I will become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound them with them. Now when she had men lying in wait in another room, she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the cords as a string of tow snaps when it touches fire. So his strength was not discovered. Now if you're familiar with this story, you know how this situation goes. You have this situation where he says, just tell me how to afflict you. He gives away a little bit of a secret, which is not a secret. She does it. He breaks right through it. This happens on 2 other occasions. And in verses 13 down through verse 17, now you have the emotional component that is thrown into this. In Judges chapter 16 and verse 13, Delilah says to Samson, up until now you have deceived me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound. Still no follow-up question from Samson, by the way. He said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my hair with the web and fasten it with the pin, then I will become weak and be like any other man. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his hair and wove them into the web. Obviously, Samson is a heavy sleeper. She fastened it with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. He awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin of the loom and the web. Then she said to him, verse 15, listen to this. How can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength is. And it came about that when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him, that his soul was annoyed to death. And you know what happens after this, don't you? Immediately after this, in the next verse, when it says that his soul is annoyed to death, he finally gives in. Judges chapter 14 and 15, as we talked about a second ago, go through great pains to illustrate the fact that Samson, ladies and gentlemen, cannot be beat. And yet in Judges chapter 16, when his wife brings in the emotional component to serve her own ends, when she brings in the emotional component, his will is slowly but surely brought down. And this is exactly, ladies and gentlemen, how temptation works. This is exactly to a T what happens when we're dealing with sin and its presence in our lives. You give it a little bit of an inch, you give it a little bit of room, you give it a little bit of attention, you give it a little bit of notice, and slowly that temptation eats at you to the point that that resolve that you had that was impenetrable, all of a sudden is torn down. I believe that Joseph recognized that. I believe that Joseph knew exactly what was going on. And I believe firmly that he knew that over time that temptation had the very real possibility of wearing him down. And so what did he do? He ran from it. The only solution that you can have. What else did he have? What other option did he have in this moment? What else could he have done except flee from it? Isaiah chapter 33, look at that if you would. Isaiah chapter 33, starting in verse 13. I've never heard anybody make this argument, and I'm thankful. But sometimes, if we're honest, sometimes we look at Joseph, or maybe this is just me, and we look at Joseph and we see how he got to this point where he ran. And we view that as a little bit of a sign of weakness. You know, Joseph is somebody who is supposed to be a pillar of the faith, and he's supposed to be this, he's supposed to be that, and yet the only recourse he had, because obviously she was right there and she was all in his face all the time, the only recourse he had was just run from it. What a coward. I don't believe that at all. And if I thought about it longer than 3 seconds, I wouldn't think that. But what Joseph displayed in this part is a sacrifice. He's giving up in the moment a little bit of ground to distance himself as far as he can from it. That's a sign of strength, ladies and gentlemen. In Isaiah chapter 33, starting in verse 13, Isaiah says, you who are far away, hear what I've done. You who are near, acknowledge my might. Sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can live with the consuming fire? Who among us can live with continual burning? He who walks righteously and speaks with sincerity. He who rejects unjust gain and shakes his hand so that they hold no bribe. He who stops his ear from hearing about bloodshed and shuts his eyes from looking upon evil. He will dwell, verse 16, on the heights. His refuge will be the impregnable rock. His bread will be given to him, and his water will be sure. You want to know how to deal with the fire? Build up integrity. You want to know how to stand up to temptation? Make sure your fortress is strong. You want to know how to exist in a world that is threatening to beat you down and your will down and your integrity down every second of every day? Fix your foundation on Christ. Because as he says in verse 17, your eyes will see the King in his beauty. They will behold a far distant land. Your heart will meditate on terror, saying, where is he who counts? Where is he who weighs? Where is he who counts the towers? You will no longer see a fierce people, a people of unintelligible speech which no one comprehends, of a stammering tongue which no one understands. Look upon Zion, the city of our appointed feast. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an undisturbed habitation, and a tent which will not be folded up. Its stakes will never be pulled up, nor any of its cords be torn apart. But there, the majestic one, the Lord will be for us, a place of rivers and of wide canals, on which no boat with oars will go, on which no mighty ship will pass. You build your foundation on Christ. And you build your resolve on what you know you're going to do every second of every day. And even if you're not being neurotic about it, you know that there are certain things that you are simply not going to engage in, no matter how hard the temptation is, and no matter how fierce the will is. Joseph displayed an impressive amount of fortitude and strength in literally removing himself from the situation to avoid giving Satan even a foothold in his life. So very quickly, what are some things we can pull from this? I know whenever somebody says very quickly, it's always like another 45 minutes. It's not. So just roll with me on this. What are some things we can learn from this? I think first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, we need to call sin by its name. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid and I always heard the phrase abstain from sexual immorality, that didn't mean a whole lot to me as a 12-year-old. That's like 3 big words and very archaic words. I didn't really know what that meant. But there is a force, there's a reason why we call this sexual immorality. There's a reason why we call adultery, adultery, an affair, an affair. There's a reason why we call theft, theft. There's a reason why we do that. It's because we need to be confronted with the reality of what that situation is. And when we talk to kids, and especially, Joseph is a great story to talk to young people about. When we talk to people of any age about fleeing sexual immorality, what we need to accentuate alongside that is the very real dangers that are present in that. Notice that Joseph didn't just say, well, I'm not going to engage in this with you because it's wrong. He didn't say that. He said why it was wrong. He said, you are not my wife. You are Potiphar's wife. And I'm not going to do this great sin and sin against God. Joseph knew exactly what was at stake here in the situation. And sometimes when we look at situations in the world and we say, well, it's not really that bad, or we rationalize it, or we say, well, we can call it by some other name. We call abortion pro-choice. When we call it like that, it softens it up. And so there's a very real need to call sin by its name and also recognize sin's inherent danger. We made this point a second ago about how it's not the first choice that he made to simply run from sin. It was the last choice that he made. But why he did that was because he knew how the story would go. And anybody that has had their life wrecked by sin of any kind knows exactly the repercussions that are inherent within that. In the moment, we don't recognize that. And by the way, let me make a brief point about this, is that what Joseph would have been engaging in with Potiphar's wife is nothing abnormal, especially of members of upper Egyptian aristocracy. You have this presentation, you have this temptation present. Everybody else was probably doing it. Nobody would have even thought twice. And there's even a thought that Potiphar wouldn't have thought twice about it. And yet Joseph knew that it was wrong. And he knew that sin had an inherent danger that he needed, no matter what the cost, to get away from. And I also want to make this point. It's that qualities that help can also hurt. Joseph and me have one thing in common. We're both extremely handsome men. It's a curse. And I think the reason that the scriptures point out that Joseph was a handsome man, and also that he was charming, and that also that he was successful, and that also that everything he seemed to touch turned into gold, is to paint the runway, or to lay the runway. I don't know how you paint a runway. You lay the runway for the temptation that was immediately going to follow. The fact that he was handsome, the fact that he was charming, the fact that he was industrious, that appealed to her. It also helped him rise through the ranks. It helped him when he's dealing with Pharaoh, helped him when he was in prison, helped him with Potiphar. It helped him rise through the ranks, but it also put him squarely in the crosshairs of Mrs. Potiphar. And so many times when we look at situations in our life, we think this is a great thing. There's obviously nothing that bad can happen from it. Remember that everything you think is good, Satan can find some way to make it bad. What is it about, ladies and gentlemen? Joseph wasn't obviously going to walk around wearing ragged clothes, trying to make himself less attractive, less handsome of a man. The thing that he was going to do was recognize the danger, recognize the balance that needed to take place. That in so many things that we take as good, and we think, this is the greatest thing ever, nothing bad can ever happen from it, there could be an inherent danger within that. And at the very least, ladies and gentlemen, we need to keep our eyes open to that. Those things that help can also hurt at various points in time. We asked the question at the beginning of this lesson, why is it that Joseph ran? It seems like such an extreme measure. You have all these other tools at your disposal. Why is it that you would run from temptation? I think as we can see here, the real question is not why Joseph ran from temptation, but why we don't more oftentimes run from temptation ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, I've never seen anybody just break tail and run because of a temptation that's present in their life. And I don't know many times where I've done that. But when the situation calls for it, and your back is against the wall, and temptation has a very real threat to destroy who you are, and your only recourse is to run. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to run. We need to remember what's at stake. And then we need to remember where our integrity is and who we are, and hold that fast above everything else, so that we can always stand before God and have our solid foundation. If you're here this morning and for some reason your heart is away from God, the idea of fleeing from temptation is so far away from your daily habits that it's just not even in your toolbox. then I would encourage you to rethink that. I would encourage you to reanalyze your relationship with God and rethink about what it is that God wants you to do, which is be holy to Him, be righteous, be steadfast, be immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. And stand firm in His presence. And do it now, ladies and gentlemen, as we stand and as we sing.